welcome back to another episode of All About the Gear. This is going to be a pretty important / interesting show. Not that the other ones aren't important and interesting, but this one particularly so because we're going to be talking about the new Sony A7s. And the A7s is critical because Sony's leading the field in terms of these full-frame mirrorless cameras, and this is the latest addition to that family. The first was the A7, the 36 megapixel monster, and then the A7R, which came out with the A7, which is more of a landscape kind of shooter's camera, and then the A7S, which, according to Sony, the S stands for sensitivity. Now, Doug K has one of these cameras and has had one for a while now and has been putting it through its paces. If you follow him on Google+, you've seen some of the images that this thing produces. Doug and I are going to dive into the specifics of this camera and, some topics that are kind of floating around it. So, Doug K, the A7S, you like it? You hate it?
Don't want to give away the punchline, but I love it.
I put him on the spot.
I love it. Well, I want people to stay with the show a little longer, but I absolutely love this camera.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you got a gazillion followers on Google+, so from your postings over there, it seems like you like it a little bit,
Just a little.
So let's talk about the basics. So what's the high level, what's the elevator spec pitch for this thing?
Yeah, first of all, as you said, it's the third camera in the Alpha mirrorless family from Sony. The A7, A7R, now the A7S. This is a 12 megapixel camera, which means by today's standard, it's fairly low in the megapixel department. Mm-hmm. But it can do two things that a lot of other cameras can't do. One is it will shoot up to 409,600 ISO. That's such a high ISO that we have to use a comma to make sure you see all the digits. And very important to some people, it will shoot in 4K video. And this is only the second camera we've had that's really a still camera format that will also shoot in 4K video, the other being the Lumix GH4. $2,500 for the body only. So it's expensive by some standards, cheap by others, but it's getting up there in terms of the mirrorless camera market, that's for sure.
Okay. Well, then before we go on, I want to dive into a little bit and talk about just the body and the feel of this thing. I know it's very similar, if not identical, to the other A7s. But who is this? I know we're going to talk about this later in the show, but in your opinion, who's this camera for? Clearly, it's for you because you have one. But who did Sony have in mind? Who was their avatar when they built this thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some people, I read other reviews. I get a chance to do that before we produce the show. Some people think it's a proof of concept for high ISO. I think it is a terrific everyday camera. I think it's for people who want the best in image quality. Obviously, high ISO and 4K video are important. But to me, it's a great all-around camera. So I shouldn't say it's good for everything. I mean, it has some weaknesses, as we'll discuss, but it is the image quality is maybe the best image quality of any digital camera I've ever used.
Wow. See, that's saying something. You even corrected yourself. Not any DSLR, any digital camera. Yeah. So including mirrorless and the DSLR monsters that are out there, this guy beats all of those guys.
To me, yes. I have to admit that that's a subjective view. You've got all the people out there who are going to take measurements, but let's face it, cameras and lenses, and particularly the combinations of cameras and lenses, have a look. Yeah. And one of the cameras we did early on in the life of All About the Gear was the Leica M and the M240, two Leica cameras that are very popular. And we talked about the fact that they just have a look that is sort of hard to describe, but they're gorgeous.
Right.
Here's a camera that I think putting Leica lenses on it, or M-mount lenses, actually looks better than the Leica M240, and that's really saying something.
That is saying something. Wow. So we're going to dive into this stuff. So before we dive into all that quality and subjectivity and all that stuff, let's talk about the body and the controls of this. We always talk about the ergonomics of these guys, and you even have a formula for kind of describing that. What did you think of this one? I mean, obviously, like I said off the top, it's the same. It looks like the same form factor as the A7 and the A7R. Is it? Are there any differences?
No, it's exactly the same. And in fact, I have an L bracket that fits exactly the same way. It's got the standard Sony alpha controls here, and that is a PASM dial. You've got hard control for exposure compensation. Depending on the mode you're in, you have soft dials for aperture and shutter. You have the typical, let me turn it on. You have the LCD, which is, tip up, tip down, doesn't articulate, and no touch.
No touch screen again.
So it has the quick menu, which is sort of nice in there, but no touch.
But none of the things that pop on the screen respond to your fingertip.
That is true. And then you've got pretty much the standard Alpha 7 ports. You've got microphone and headphone.
Nice.
And then, of course, you've got HDMI out and their fancy USB, which also triggers their proprietary remotes. And then, good EVF. The LCD and the EVF are both great. They're pretty much standard for this line. Battery, SD card. That's all there is.
Tripod mount in the right place, like on the lens axis?
Yes, it is. There it is.
There it is.
Centered on the lens. Hallelujah.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things we've talked about, as we said, is we have the Uncle Doug's exposure triangle test, and that is for the things that control exposure, which would be shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and exposure compensation. How easy is it to get to them? Where having a dedicated knob like exposure compensation means it's really easy, and having to go into the menu system means it's almost impossible. And we give this a score of 9 out of 12, which is pretty good for mirrorless cameras.
Not bad. We have to start rating these things and giving them star ratings as we
just like everybody else does, right?
Yeah, just like that. Okay, so what about charging? One of the things on some cameras, and I can't remember, it's like hit or miss with the cameras, like if they charge in camera or if you have to take the battery out and put it in a charger and charge it that way. How is it with this camera?
Yeah, this is something that our friend Gordon Lang got us started on, which is the value of in-camera charging.
Yeah.
But of course, that usually means that you don't get a battery charger, so you really have to charge it in camera or buy a third-party charger. Well, surprise, when I opened the box, this one had a separate charger and it charges in the camera, so you get best of both worlds. But I think for $2,500, throwing in a charger is the least we can expect, so it's got both.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of this thing. Most important, arguably, for any camera, especially this one, since it has the S behind the A7 moniker there, which stands for sensitivity, is the sensor, right? So what did you find? I mean, does it live up to that, okay, must put a comma in the ISO number range, or are we seeing golf ball size grain or usable images at high ISOs? What's Doug's findings there?
Yeah, and I think that normally when people advertise ISO, they, a lot of these cameras have like an H1 or H2 setting that said, it goes above the recommended ISO. So the normal ISO, the normal high ISO for this is a whopping 102,000. But you can take it to 204 and 409, but these images are not particularly useful.
Define usable. So you say usable ISO at 102,400. What is usable? Does that mean you could print it, or you can't discern the grain? What is usable?
That means it's not going to meet commercial criteria. This is my definition. It's not going to meet commercial criteria. You're going to definitely need noise reduction in post-processing because you're going to have either monochrome or color noise. But if someone's hiring you, certainly for a print job, this is not going to cut it. But still, can you get an image that you'd be happy to post online? Absolutely, at 102,000. So that's pretty good. I'm pretty comfortable shooting up to 25,600. I let the camera go that high on its own, and for my purposes, that's pretty good, especially if I decide I'm going to print in monochrome, because, of course, the quality of the noise matters as much as the quantity, and the quality of the noise in cameras like this look pretty good in black and white. It starts to look like film grain. But what's interesting is the interesting thing about this camera is how does it look at what we would call low ISOs for this camera?
I was going to ask that, yeah.
3200, 6400, and it's gorgeous. This camera looks as good at 3200 as most cameras look at 200 or 400.
That's
And
insane.
that literally changes the way you shoot.
Of course, yeah. I remember when I was shooting film, I had a little pocket in my camera bag that had, the crazy ISO film in there in case I had to shoot in darkness or whatever, and it was usually 3200. So that was my break glass in case of emergency film.
Right.
So you're saying that
that was always
3200 is kind of the norm on this thing.
well, not the norm, but I have no hesitation to shoot at 3200 no matter what the mission is. If I'm going to be printing large, I'm still happy to shoot at 3200 with this camera, whereas a lot of my other cameras, I get nervous above 200 or certainly above 400. So it's quite spectacular.
Do you have any insight into what Sony's doing there to pull out that much detail with so low levels of light? It just seems like almost voodoo. Like how do you do that? I've seen some of the images online that are like taken of a beach scene at night. You can't even see the ocean, and then you see an image from the A7s, and you can see the ocean and the pier. And Philip Bloom did this review where some of the before and afters. Just amazing. Do you have any insight into how they're doing this?
Yeah, there are really four things that go into that. Three of them have to do with the area of the pixels. If you can make the pixels catch more photons, you're going to be more sensitive to light given the same shutter speed. So one is they come down to 12 megapixels, which of course means that it's a full frame sensor, so the pixels are quite physically large.
Right.
The second is they use what's called a rear illuminated sensor. Now, that's a little misleading. What it means is that the little wires or connections that go onto each pixel are actually on the back side. With older traditional sensors, the wires actually blocked out some of the light. And the third is that they have a gapless sensor, and that means that there's almost no space between the pixels, again, making them a little larger. The fourth thing is the processing. Sony's really hit it out of the park with their Bions processor, or however Beyonce processor we used to call it. Yeah. But this processor clearly is doing substantial noise reduction and doing a great job in it. So those four things together are what's giving us this quality.
So the other piece, and thanks for that. That's exactly what I want to know, is that level of detail. But the other piece is dynamic range, and we talk about that a lot on the show with regard to these different cameras, and some of them have a much more limited dynamic range versus other ones. On this one, I would assume that it's fairly wide latitude. What did you find?
Sony pitches this as being 15.3 stops of dynamic range. How they come up with that number, I have no clue.
It was probably 15. They said, put the 3 on there to make it more plausible, make it seem like we did our homework.
Like pretend we have actual scientists who measure this. But of course they do. They do, but compared to what, I think is the question. Again, because the photo sites are so large, the pixels are so large, they think of collecting rain in a bucket. The wider the mouth of the bucket, the more rain you're going to collect, and the difference between the smallest amount of rain and the largest amount of rain is substantial, because you can have one drop up to a whole lot more water in a wider mouth bucket. So the difference between what barely causes light to register versus the maximum that can be registered without blowing it out is substantial. Now, my tests are, again, completely subjective. I think the dynamic range is spectacular. There are some reviews out there who are not as impressed with the dynamic range, so you get to pick who you want to listen to. But from my opinion, I think it's just spectacular. It's huge. I did a lot of shooting in very harsh midday summer light. I've got a shot which, if you're watching the video, I'm going to put up here. Otherwise, you can find it on the blog. But it is, a couple sitting under a black umbrella. The woman's wearing a black shirt, and her arm is in bright sunlight. And this camera, catches detail in everything from her black shirt all the way to the bright arm. So I can't do that with any other camera that I own.
That's crazy. Okay, so then the big question comes at the top. You said this was a 12 megapixel camera, right?
Yep.
So which kind of brings up another question that I have. So what, a year ago or so, maybe even less, it was all about the megapixel. Even with Sony, with the A7, 36 megapixel, using the same, presumably the same sensor as the Nikons that are shooting 36 megapixel images. When we look at this one, it's exponentially smaller. It's 12 megapixels. That's less megapixels than I get on my Micro Four Thirds cameras, which are 16 megapixels.
Correct.
How is that working? I mean, is that enough? Is 12 enough? And what kind of magic are they doing in there to make it enough?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because this megapixel thing has been going around for so long and confusing so many people. It's true. When the Nikon D800 and D800E came out, I think it was about 2 years ago, we all drooled over the fact that we had 36 megapixels and we now had something that was akin to a medium format camera in a DSLR body.
Yeah.
And the D800 and 800E are spectacular cameras. There's no doubt about it. But there are really only two reasons that I think anybody needs more pixels as opposed to fewer. Number one is if you're going to print large, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Number two is if you need to crop and still retain a certain print size. So, I did the math. Let's assume you print at 240 dots per inch, which is pretty much the standard for inkjet printing.
Mm-hmm.
This camera, 12 megapixels, is going to print up to 12 by 18 inches. So, if you don't crop the image, you can print 12 by 18 at full resolution. Mm-hmm. Now, with software like Lightroom and some other plugins that you can buy, you can double that. You can actually print a 180 DPI image. And in that case, the images from this camera can be printed up to 16 by 24. Now, for some people, I don't print anything larger than 16 by 24. My printer pretty much maxes out at 17 inches.
Mine too, yeah.
And, some people want to print gigantic murals and they're going to need more. Some people online who print large and use some specialized software will go all the way down to 120, and they can get 24 by 36 inch images. 24 by 36 out of this camera, pretty good. So, again, you have to look at what you need to do. If you're going to, shoot with a 36 megapixel sensor. Now, remember, that's the square area. So, a 12 megapixel camera isn't half the size on each dimension as a 24, let's say, because you've got to, do the Pythagoras, blah, blah, all of this stuff, right?
All that crazy math stuff.
Yeah, the square root of the sum of the squares and all that. But the fact is that, this camera, for me, will shoot everything I need. I don't have to do that kind of dramatic cropping, and something that will allow me to print 16 by 24 is great. So that's the first thing. And of course, the other thing is, wow, do I get smaller files out of this? Mm-hmm. My other Sonys are 24 megapixels and the files are twice as large. So that's another benefit.
Wow. So it sounds so far positive, right? So what does this mean for normal light shooting? So you're out there shooting on a regular photo walking Doug K day. Are you walking around like Superman with his cape tucked in, or?
Oh, I am. In fact, I've been known to let the cape out.
Nice.
And that's the other important thing about a camera with high ISO. People think, oh, I don't need high ISO because I don't shoot in the dark. And I want to explain a different way of using the camera that I've certainly started doing with this camera more than any other. And that is this. I usually shoot with most cameras in aperture priority mode. Now, for people who don't know about that, that's where I select the aperture. The camera selects the shutter speed that will give me the proper exposure. Mm-hmm. The option, of course, for some sports and things, you might turn this to S for shutter priority, and you might select the shutter speed, let the camera select the aperture. Manual, of course, means that you select everything, but what's missing from this equation is ISO.
Yeah.
Normally, you're going to shoot, normally you don't want your camera to go above, let's say, 400 ISO. So you set the ISO to 400 or whatever you want to use. And Once you select the ISO, the camera in aperture priority selects the shutter, in shutter priority selects the aperture, manual, you do both. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But here's a new way of shooting. Suppose I put it into ISO. Say, I don't care whether this thing shoots anywhere from 100 to 3,200. How many stops is that? I don't know. That's about 6 or 8 stops of range, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I want to select the shutter speed and the aperture, which is great because I go out and I say, well, hey, I've got a moving subject. I've got a slightly long lens. I want to shoot at a 250th of a second, but I want to have a moderate depth of field, so I'm going to shoot at 5.6 or f8. And let the camera select the ISO because the quality isn't going to be significantly different.
That is
this is a new way of shooting for me, and I think a lot of serious photographers who are used to aperture priority most commonly, or sometimes shutter priority. Go in, get the aperture you want, get the shutter speed you want. Don't worry about it. The camera's going to give you a good picture.
Wow.
So
see, now I'm wanting to try that because that's like the holy grail there. So. Because now it's just f-stops and shutter speeds, and you have magic film in your camera that can dynamically adjust its ISO depending on what you ask for on your main exposure, shutter, and aperture settings.
Right, and you still have exposure compensation if you want to tweak it. But think about the times you've been in aperture priority mode and said, "Wow, I just love the way this looks through the viewfinder," only to find out your shutter speed was too slow.
Right.
Or vice versa. You shot with a particular shutter speed, but the aperture was too wide. And you say, oh, damn, I wish I could have controlled both of them. Well, I could have, except the ISO would have been wacko. So that's
can you is this a camera where you might consider shooting sports with?
I would, except for the autofocus. So
okay.
if I'm going to shoot sports with manual focus, which I do on occasion, it's not easy, that's fine. But the autofocus in this camera is weak, and we can talk about that too.
Okay, well let's get into that a little bit. But first, I want to talk about the displays on there, which along with the sensor and the optics and all that, and the processor, of course, I would say is one of the most important pieces on a digital camera, especially a mirrorless camera like this. So the EVF, or the electronic viewfinder, and the LCD or liquid crystal display on the back of the camera, how is it?
They're good. I mean, they're, I think, unchanged from the other Alpha 7 cameras. They're very good. They work fine. I wish that the little sensor that switches to the EVF when you get near it wasn't quite so sensitive, or you could control it, because sometimes it thinks I'm looking through the viewfinder when I'm not.
Yeah.
But they're great. They're great. Again, the key is it doesn't fully articulate, the LCD, and it's not touch sensitive. And those are
no touch screen. We have beat up on Sony, and hopefully the whole next generation of this stuff, they'll listen to us, because you and I are always right. We're always right. We are never wrong. What about noise of this thing, Doug? I know when I was playing around with the A7R, I believe it was, right when Sony launched it. One of the things that bugged me was the amount of noise when you press a shutter. It was like 2 shutter clicks, and it was relatively loud. Like I was thinking you would not be shooting a wedding or anything like that with this thing, because it is it's noticeably louder than other cameras. Did you find that on this one as well?
Yeah, I mean, just to go back a second, the A7R has a mechanical front and rear shutter, which means, remember, you're starting in live view mode, the equivalent of live view for a DSLR, which means you're looking at the picture from the sensor. That means the sensor is not covered with the shutter.
Yeah.
So in the A7R, it has to close, erase the sensor, open, take the picture, close again, read the sensor, and then open again so you can view it, so you get the double click. The A7 by default has an electronic front curtain shutter, which means the shutter only closes at the end of the exposure. Now, this camera is interesting because it has this mode. You hear that?
No.
Let me do it again. You hear it this time?
I heard a little click.
No, you didn't.
I heard something.
That must have been my teeth.
That might have been your knuckles.
This camera has the option of going full silent with no mechanical shutter at either the front or rear curtain.
Very cool.
And you and I have both come to like this in many other cameras, especially for street shooting, where you can be out there and taking pictures and you are not disturbing anybody. Very nice. By default, it starts out with a mechanical rear curtain, so you hear click at the end of the exposure, but you can turn that off, and you can get it to go full electronic, full silent, not making a sound at all.
Well, while we're talking about the display on there, one thing that we ding Sony on, aside from the touchscreen and non-articulated LCD, is the apps, or the not the apps, but the user interface, or the OS on this camera, the operating system. And historically, it's been, I think, what Trey said something. Trey Radcliffe used to say it's like, it was designed by people that don't know UI. I mean, what was he said something else, but I'm kind of buffering it a little bit. So, what was your findings? Is this any better than the other cameras in the Alpha line, or the
It's
NEX, or?
it's exactly the same. Well, it's the Alpha line is miles ahead of the NEX series because the NEX series had the worst menus of any camera I've ever used. The Alpha series, they're better. They're still not nearly as good, let's say, as Panasonic Lumix, which probably has some of the best, or Olympus, or even Fuji. But these are okay. I've gotten used to them. I've had Sony cameras now for quite a while, and I'm pretty fast with them. They have the unique feature of all of the Alpha cameras that you have downloadable apps. That's good and bad. And good in the fact that you can, update your camera with new apps. Down in that it's a little cumbersome to do so at times.
Yeah.
But you get some nice features. The equivalent of
apps and that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's pretty good. We haven't seen any change from Sony in the last year and a half in that area. So we'll have to see where that heads in the next version.
Have they improved the flow of actually putting apps on the camera? Because I've got the NEX 5R, which also allows you to download apps and add functionality that way. But I found it a little clunky, to kind of get the apps in there, and it just, and some of the things that they were allowing you to download, like time lapse, for example. I was thinking, how can we just build this into the camera? Why do I have to go and jump through backflips just to put a couple lines of code in my camera? What were your findings?
It's still clunky. I mean, part of it's inevitable in that, you have to find a Wi-Fi network. You may have to log into that network if it needs a password. You then are connected to your Play Memories account, which you have to then log into, if perhaps, or maybe that takes a password. So it's a pain. But once you get it set up, it's pretty good. And I do like the fact that, slowly over time, Sony's released more apps. I wish that they would open the APIs and let third-party developers create apps. That would be spectacular, but we're not at that stage yet.
So let third-party developers design the whole camera operating system. That would be awesome.
The Alex Lindsay camera.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I mean, speaking of Wi-Fi, Doug, so connectivity options on this thing. We've come to expect the Wi-Fi. What else does this guy have?
Well, it's got NFC, which is standard now on all the Sony cameras. No GPS. We're waiting for that to catch up too. That's one of my favorite things, but lots of options for doing it otherwise. But
NFC, just for the folks that don't know what that is, it's near field communications, and that's that technology that's in most Android phones that allows, and tablets or devices that allow you to tap the cell phone or Android device to the camera, and they instantly handshake and do that connection, so that you don't have to go in and punch in passwords and all that stuff. You just tap it and boom, they're connected.
Yeah, the key is this little icon here. Does that show up?
Yeah. It did, and then it went away.
It didn't went away. There it is.
There it
okay. Is. That's the little near field communications icon, the little N or Z or whatever that little thing is there. Yeah. So near field communications is great. There's a rumor that Apple may have that in the next generation iPhone, which I would love because I am an iPhone user.
I would love that if they did that. I mean, at least bring the market up, because if iPhone does it, then we'll start seeing all kinds of devices. It becomes normal, if Apple and Google are embracing the technology.
Yep.
What about autofocus? You mentioned that it's not so good for sports. What were you finding? Just slow, fast, average?
There are a couple of things here. First of all, the camera does not have a very fast shutter rate. The camera, if you want to autofocus, if you put it in continuous shooting mode, and you want to focus on every frame, this is only going to do 2.5 frames a second, which is really slow by today's standards. You've got cameras that'll go up to 11 or 12 frames a second. Even within the Sony line, I think you can get 11 frames a second out of the Alpha 6000.
Yeah.
if you only want to autofocus on the first frame, you can get that up to 5 frames a second. Still relatively pathetic, but that's one restriction is, 2.5 frames a second. In fact, when you shoot, you feel like it's 1001, 1002. You feel like it's about one per 1 per second.
Yeah, that's a negative. Yeah.
And the autofocus is, they don't have phase detection that you get now on the A7 and the A6000. The A7s and the A7R do not have phase detection on the sensor. And that means that, again, your continuous autofocus in particular is going to be weak because the camera is going to have to do a lot of hunting, in order to make that work. But it makes up for it in an interesting way, in that because the sensor is so sensitive, this camera can autofocus in extremely low light. This camera, like the Nikon D4S, can focus almost in the dark, and that's quite phenomenal. Again, that's strictly due to the fact that the sensor is so good. So
wow, that's exciting.
It's a trade-off.
That's exciting. So let's talk about the other pieces, manual focus, and then the focus peaking piece of this, right? So that's another benefit of these mirrorless cameras, is the image is being projected directly onto the sensor rather than bouncing off of a mirror, which means you can overlay data onto the image that's being displayed to the photographer. Things like focus peaking or outlining things that are in focus, a la Terminator, right?
Right.
This guy has that, right?
It does, yeah, and all the Alpha 7 cameras do. A6000 camera does as well, and so focus peaking is great for manual focus. The whole reason I personally got into the A7 line was I wanted a way to use some of these legacy lenses without having to pay the price of a Leica and deal with a rangefinder, because I'm sorry, Leica fans, I know the mail's coming. I'm not a rangefinder guy. I'm an EVF, electronic viewfinder guy. So focus peaking is great, really no different than it is on the other cameras, but it works quite well.
Yeah. All right. So then the $1 million question here is video, right? Yeah. So that's been the topic of a lot of the YouTube videos and articles that I see out there about this particular camera, particularly comparing it to Panasonic's Lumix GH4, which also shoots 4K and is mirrorless. However, that one's micro four thirds and this is full frame. So give me the top down before we start comparison and all that stuff. What does this give you? So, it's 4K obviously, but what else?
Yeah, it's 4K. It'll give you that up to 30 frames a second. Mm-hmm. Unlike the Lumix GH4, it cannot record 4K to the built-in SD card. Not built-in, but to the SD card.
Right.
You can only record to an external recorder. And by the way, within a reasonable price, there are no such external recorders at this time. We're looking at fourth quarter of this year, and we're going to have the Shogun come out from Atomus, or however they pronounce it. That recorder is going to come out for about $2,000. So, interesting challenge. You got to carry an extra box with you hooked up by a cable to the HDMI port in order to record your video with this camera. Now,
so if I'm hearing you right now, if I went out and bought this camera, because I've been hearing about this 4K and low light and all that stuff, I'm not shooting 4K unless I go to some third party at some point in the future and purchase an add-on that I then plug into my camera that will then suck in that 4K and allow me to record it. So today I can't do it. Is that correct?
That's correct. You cannot record 4K on this camera today unless you have a fairly high-end system, a special card from Blackmagic, for example, that will allow you to record into a PCI slot or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, so you cannot shoot 4K under reasonable circumstances yet.
But you can still shoot 1080 though, right?
Absolutely.
And record that directly to the card.
Yeah, and the 1080 looks really good because the 1080 is relatively small compared to our still camera sensors. So if you take something like the Lumix camera, you actually have many more pixels than you're going to need for 1080. So you're going to have to downsample it to get it down to 1080. Mm-hmm. And you may lose some quality in that process. In this case, I think it's exactly 2-to-1 or close to it. So you basically combine 2 pixels into one instead of combining 3.5 pixels into one, which of course is going to give you funny results. So,
right.
We wanted to invite Dave Dugdale on the show. He did a great job with us on the last show where we reviewed the Lumix GH4. And I checked with Dave. He's not ready because he hasn't finished his testing of this camera because it's brand new. I decided that we really wanted to get this review out because this is such a hot topic right now. But I do hope that within the next few weeks, Dave will have his review online and everybody will be able to go look at that one. Because
Yeah, and his reviews are amazing, by the way, and you can find Dave Dugdale over at learningdslrvideo.com, and he's got some, I think he's most recently famous for saying that he's ditching Canon in favor of likely Panasonic GH4 Sony A7s combination, but we'll see. Yeah.
We'll see whether the Sony either makes the cut or is so good that it displaces the GH4.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Interesting times, regardless. So
yeah.
Okay, cool. So what else? What else on the video side?
Yeah, it will shoot 1080p up to 60 frames a second, which is sort of nice for that slow-mo stuff. At 720p, you can actually go all the way to 120 frames a second, so you can get the 4 times or 1/4 speed, which is nice.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting, I'm not going to say too much about it because I'm going to be over my head the moment I open my mouth, and we'll wait for Dave, but they've taken a lot of the technology from their pro video cameras and put it into this thing. In particular, there are things called picture profiles that allow you to control things like black level, gamma, the knee, the color phase, and so forth. And what I think Dave is particularly interested in is what's called the S-Log2 option, which is to take advantage of the huge dynamic range of this camera. It actually shoots at a totally different contrast curve than previous cameras. So it basically moves the tonal range into a different part of the curve to really allow you to take advantage of that range. So go to Dave for explanations of what those are.
Yeah. For the deep dive, go to Dave. There you go. Right. Very cool. So in audio and headphone jacks, you showed me that earlier, so that's good.
We got that right, and it's perfectly capable video camera, and again, you're getting the very low light. So the 1080p is gorgeous out of this because you have tremendous dynamic range, very low noise, and very high ISO. So it's a great camera for video for getting the 4K just at 1080p.
Yeah, see, that's what I guess I need to play with the camera because the thing that comes into my head especially when Nikon came out initially with the D4 with a crazy high ISO, I was thinking like, when do I actually have a need to shoot a ninja in a closet holding a black cat with the lights off? So that, and you could, presumably shoot that with this particular camera. But I was thinking, like, back over the years, how many instances have I been in where I needed those ultra high ISOs? Or the other, so there's a devil and angel on my shoulder. The angel is saying, well, maybe you haven't felt the need to use that because you haven't had it. If you had that capability, you would have got some shots that you ordinarily would not have gotten. What do you think, Doug? I mean, is it am I missing it or what?
It's a little different in video because we're working with fairly slow shutter speeds, which means we don't really need the high ISOs as much. So if you're shooting normal at 24 or 30 frames a second video, you're going to be using a shutter speed of a 50th or a 60th of a second, something that's actually quite a bit slower than we might use for stills, especially with longer lenses.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, let's say you want to shoot slow motion, and you want to shoot at 60 frames a second. You might use 120th. Now you're starting to say, okay, what am I going to do? Well, maybe you want to shoot at f11, f16. Now you're saying, now light might be an interesting problem, especially indoors. Now you want to crank up the ISO. So again, the high ISO, the main thing is it broadens the mission. It gives you more choices.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing. It's not like, I'm going to grab this because I'm doing a movie by candlelight. That's not the point. It's the wider range of situations total in which you can shoot.
So for the most part, Doug, is off-camera flash dead? Like with this kind of camera, do you actually are you walking around with a strobe in your bag anymore?
I got to tell you, I just bought the mid-size Sony strobe only for one reason, and that's to have one.
Yeah.
It's sitting on the shelf. I don't know if I'll ever use it. This camera does not have a flash built in. None of the A7s do. It's got a hot shoe, but no flash. And I told a friend of mine, I said, "You don't have a flash?" I said, "Well, no, I don't really need one because I can see in the dark."
Right. Right.
So,
but for things like excuse me, like fill flash and creative effects and that sort of thing, you're still going to need a flash.
you will, or for fill flash for this, hold up your palm, get a little reflection. It doesn't take much with this camera.
Bring a little flashlight along with you. You're good to go.
It's amazing. And again, it's a shooting style thing. If you're going to be in a studio and you want to trigger the strobes, you need to buy a flash to put onto this thing to trigger your remote strobes. There's no doubt about that.
Does it have a PC slot on there, or not a PC slot, but a PC port to plug in?
No, I think I'm not sure, but I think you put it in the hot shoe and it has a PC adapter.
Oh, the adapter. Yeah.
So you get this little cube that sits in the hot shoe, and that does it. But I haven't, except for weddings, which I try not to do. Some portraits where you're right. For portraits, I've used some fill flash.
Yeah.
I haven't used a flash in a couple of years, except for those 2 assignments, I think. Yeah. So it's totally a matter of what you shoot. Totally, that's what it's
interesting. All right, let's close it off here. So one of the last things would be competition. We always talk about who are the peers for this particular camera, and what are your findings, or what do you think after using it, and and using all the other cameras that we talk about on All About the Gear? Who's going head to head with this guy?
It's a really good question, because sometimes it's easy to figure out who the competitors are, and sometimes it isn't. In this case, I first looked at the high ISO cameras, and those are the Nikon D4S and the Nikon DF, both of which we've reviewed on previous episodes of the show. Yeah. The D4S, of course, costs $6,500, and it's the size of a bus.
Yeah.
In terms of overall camera, if I really had to pick the best camera you can buy for the largest range of missions, the D4S is still my favorite camera, although I don't own one.
Yeah.
It's essentially the same ISO range. I think the image quality is so close to this that you can barely tell the difference, but this one might actually eke it out by a bit. It's 16 megapixels. It's a slightly denser sensor.
Yeah. The D4S is not shooting 4K video, though, right?
It is not. It is not. That's true. And let's admit something up front. I'm not a video guy here. So although we include video in the reviews, I do it only kicking and screaming.
Yes, and we look to Dave Dugdale for the video slant of these cameras.
That's right. The Nikon DF has what I think is the same sensor as the D4S for less than half the price, but it's a weird little camera. Not even weird. It's a weird big camera, and I have problems with it for other reasons. But it's $3,000. Well, compared to this at $2,500, that's not a huge difference. And if you've got an investment in Nikon glass and love it, then you might be better off with a Nikon DF than going to something like this, because you've got to replace the lenses.
Yeah, but again, no 4K. And the Nikon DF is kind of like the Gollum of digital cameras.
Weird metaphor.
It's a little weird. It kind of looks like it's weird. Huh.
You gonna do the voice?
No.
Okay.
I will spare the audience my Gollum voice, but I may do my my Norman Bates mother voice at some point.
I can hardly wait.
Yeah. What about so we talked to the last review that we did previous to this one was the Panasonic. What about that guy?
Yeah, the GH4 camera we both really like. It's quite a bit cheaper too. It's only $1,800 compared to the $2,500 for this one, so it's $700 cheaper. Also shoots 4K video, and of course the beauty of that is it stores the video on the SD card. So for mortals, people who don't want to carry around an extra box with a cable,
or an assistant,
or an assistant, right? A Sherpa. If you really want to shoot 4K video today, your GH4 is one of your only choices, and an excellent camera. So I wouldn't hesitate there.
But this guy, it sounds like, so the Panasonic GH4 Micro Four Thirds camera, $1,800, shoots 4K, stores it on the card. The Sony A7s shoots 4K, and it will only record it with, a Sherpa or a third party thing that you plug into it to record the HD. However, the A7S has that insane sensitivity. So from this review, what I'm getting, kind of, if you look at both of these cameras together and you're considering the Panasonic GH4 versus the A7S on the Sony side, if you're leaning more towards doing multimedia and stills as well as video, you might want to lean towards the A7 or the GH4. If you're more of a photography, then and like Doug, right, where video is ancillary to everything you do, and you care more about the stills and the image quality, not so much image quality, but the low light sensitivity and all that, then you're going to lean more towards an A7S.
Yeah, I think you've got
Correct?
it pretty close. If you want 4K video for mortals, with good still photography, the Lumix GH4 is great. If you want 4K video, again, we don't know that it's better until Dave tells us. But if you want the high ISO and if you want the best image quality, then this is probably a better camera for you.
Yeah, yeah. And if you've got unlimited funds, buy them both, and you're covered on all bases, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you can also compare this to the other A7s. Just to wrap that up, the basic A7, which I also love, is only $1,500. It does have better autofocus and 24 megapixels, a higher resolution sensor for those who want to print larger. And those who want to print really large or do a lot of cropping, the A7R, $2,300, almost the same price as this one, 36 megapixels. But I'll tell you, from everyone who's used that camera, myself included, it needs a lot of babysitting. It will show every flaw in your process. So that's one to only use if you really want to be careful.
Yeah, I stick by it. I still think the A7R is a replacement for medium format. So if you're thinking that you're the more considered shooter, where you're like the Ansel Adams and you're driving out to Yosemite and you've got your camera on a tripod and everything's perfect, and okay, now I'm ready to take the shot, and ka-clunk, you get the shot. Or in the case of the A7R, ka-clunk, ka-clunk. You give a shot, right? It's not for the run and gun street photographer where you're trying to be stealthy and silent, and it's not for the sports photographer where you need multiple frames a second. It's for those people that are doing, I need ultra high resolution. So, I would say Karen Hutton, for example, doing ultra high resolution, beautiful landscapes, and she's thinking about every little detail before she takes the shot. That's more of an A7R shooter, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're absolutely right.
All right, Doug. So at the top of the show, we kind of opened it with, who is this camera for? So taking into account all the discussion about the GH4 and all the other A7 models and the Nikons and all that, pricing and all that, who should be looking at this camera? Who's this targeted at?
Well, I think certainly videographers and multimediagraphers should look seriously at this camera, although we really have to wait until people like Dave Dugdale finish their reviews to let us know how it compares to the GH4, because after all, as we said, the GH4 can record directly to SD. That's one. Anybody who needs low light, this is certainly up there, one of the best, if not the best, for low light photography. But I think it's a great general purpose camera. This is the camera that I shoot more than any other camera now. The only two times I'm using anything else are if I'm just doing street photography and I want fast autofocus. Mm-hmm. Then I'm taking my little A6000, which is a fraction of the cost. Yeah. Or if I need to do sports or action, I'm taking my D3S. So those are the two things. But it's a great general purpose camera, particularly using that trick we talked about where you put it into manual mode and let the camera figure out the ISO. And I'm prepared to get the email on this. I want you to know the bulletproof vest is on. I think this is a Leica killer. I think if you want the best quality images with a Leica digital, with Leica lenses and a digital camera, I think this beats the Leica cameras themselves.
All right. Well, from the looks of it, Sony has a winner on their hands. So
Yeah. Oh, I want to mention one other thing. Yep. If you're interested in this thing about the A7S versus Leica and with Leica lenses, go to Steve Huff's website. I think it's either stevehuff.com or stevehuffphoto.com. Steve does a great job of reviewing the use of M-mount lenses on these alpha cameras, and I think you'll be really interested in what he has to say.
Lovely. Awesome. It's exciting times for us shooters these days, huh, Doug K?
It's amazing, just amazing. And we're coming up on new camera season, so I'm afraid to even think of what's going to happen.
Well, give us a foreshadowing glimpse into what the next piece of toy you're going to be playing with is.
Well, we've got 3 in a row. One is this little, again, Sony, the RX100 Mark III, which is a point and shoot that actually has a built-in electronic viewfinder that you can pop up, which is
That's cool.
Quite an unusual thing. The Lumix FZ1000, another 4K video-capable camera, is coming in. It's a super zoom. And we're getting a very unusual camera that people don't talk about much, but we're really curious about, and that is the Sigma DP2 Quattro. We're getting a hold of one of those. So it's going to be an exciting month.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, I think this has been an informative episode of All About the Gear. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about these other cameras.
Yep. It never stops.
All right, Doug. Well, you have a good day, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, Frederick. Talk to you soon.
All right, see you.